Evet değerli misafirlerimiz hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Ben Doktor Özgür Öktem. Üreme Sağlığını Koruma Derneği olarak bu anlamlı günde beraberiz. Bugün çok özel bir gün. 19 Mayıs 1919'da özgürlük meşalesine yakıldığı Atatürk'ün Samsun'a çıkışıyla başlayan bugün de bizim de çok özel bir misafirimiz var. Doktor Profesör İlay Adaşi konuğumuz olacaklar. Kendileri bizi kırmadılar. Bu anlamlı günde bize canlı olarak bağlanmayı kabul ettiler. Doktor Adaşi'yi tanıtmaya aslında gerek yok. Hepiniz biliyorsunuz. Kendisi bir klinisyen bilim insanı, reproduktif endokrinolojinin duayenlerinden. Kendisi 15'in üzerinde textbook, üreme sağlığı ile ilgili textbook yazmış. 450'nin üzerinde peer review article'ı olan, 50'nin üzerinde bilim insanı yetiştirmiş, gerçek bir klinisyen bilim insanı. Brown Üniversitesi Tıp Fakültesi'nin eski dekanı, hala da aktif olarak çalışmaya, üretmeye devam ediyor. Bugün bizi kırmadılar. Bu Atatürk'ü anma Gençlik ve Spor Bayramı'nda bizimle beraber oldular. Kendisi bugün bizlere hepimizin bildiği gen editleme olarak kısaca tarif edebileceğimiz CRISPR teknolojisi de dahil olmak üzere bu seneki bilim insanlığı Nobel Tıp Ödülü kazandıran, Nobel Kimya Ödülü kazandıran, CRISPR teknolojileri de dahil olmak üzere gen editleme çalışmaları şu an ne aşamada, uygulamalar bizi nereye götürüyor? Bu konu hakkında kendisi bize aydınlatacak. Sorularınızı her zaman kullandığınız platform üzerinden bizlere yönlendirebilirsiniz. Toplantının sonunda kendilerine sorularımız olacak, onları yönelteceğiz. Dr. Adashi, once again, thank you very much for being with us in this special day of commemoration day of Atatürk and Youth and Sports Day. So the microphone is yours, sirs. We are not on the stage. Thank you very much again, once again, being with us.
Well, thank you, Dr. Akhtam. It's a pleasure to join you all today. And as I understand it, on a very special day, Atatürk Day. And so I'm pleased to share with you some thoughts about where this all might be going with heritable human genome editing, or as it is sometimes referred to, germline editing. And so what I will seek to do today is to provide an overview and leave you with a sense of where we stand today and what the future might evolve into, although of course, none of us can actually foresee the future in any precise way. CRISPR appeared on the scene effectively in 2012, although a group of investigators has studied this phenomenon prior to that. But the 2012 science paper by Dudna, Charpentier, and others really started the CRISPR era in an official fashion, if you will. In this respect, CRISPR is just the end point at present of a series of developments that began in the 80s and that are still ongoing, during which scientists were looking for genome editors. This began with the so-called meganucleases, which were big in the 80s, followed by so-called zinc finger nucleases, which appeared later on, and the so-called TALENs, or transcription activator-like effector nucleases, all of which had functionalities of gene editors, but were cumbersome, relatively complex, and not all that flexible, which is why the appearance of CRISPR-Cas9 and its congeners has revolutionized virtually everything in this arena. This has to do with the fact that the CRISPR-Cas9 endonuclease is unique and stands out in terms of its targetability, fidelity, malleability, and versatility, attributes that could not be ascribed to some of its predecessors. To repair multi-base mutations in principle, one would have to effectuate a double-strand DNA break and then repair it by what is known as homology-directed repair, or HDR for short. In somatic cells, such repair will involve the provision of an exogenous DNA template. And in the zygote, it has been suggested, although that remains uncertain, that repair might actually involve the endogenous wild-type allele. When you create a double-strand DNA break, you trigger non-HDR DNA repair mechanisms which the cell is endowed with naturally. That is known as non-homology end joining, or NHEJ for short, which regrettably gives rise to small stochastic on-off target insertions and or deletions, also known as indels, or to large on-target deletions and complex rearrangements. In other words, all kinds of genomic mayhem may follow the creation of a double-strand break and the efforts on the part of the cell to repair it. When it comes to repairing single base mutations, we do not really have to produce a double-strand DNA break, which is a great advantage. And that became possible courtesy of the so-called base editors that are CRISPR variants, if you will, that have the capacity to convert, for example, a CG pair to a TA pair, or an AT pair to a GC pair, without creating a double-strand DNA break, and therefore, hopefully, with less in the way of DNA mayhem, which follows the double-strand DNA break. The challenges that are faced by CRISPR in general, but in the embryo in particular, have to do with efficiency, which is to say that it will actually execute its function in an efficient and reliable way. Specificity, meaning that it will actually effectuate the changes we hope it would, and uniformity, which is to say that these changes will in fact apply to every single cell of the embryo. Mosaicism will not do. That would not be acceptable, because that would mean that some cells have been edited and others have not. So as we look forward, the implementation of CRISPR in the context of the human embryo will require that the criteria of efficiency, specificity, and uniformity are conformed with and applied in an optimal fashion. Which brings us to the editing of the human germline and the specific issues related to it, as well as the history of those efforts. And I'll try to bring you all up to date on where we stand on this issue. The first question we may wish to ask ourselves, what is the objective of heritable genome editing or germline editing? And the answer is correctly, I think, to prevent disabling and life-truncating monogenic maladies. We sometimes refer to this as remedial germline editing. It's editing to correct genetic disorders and to prevent the birth of children who are otherwise would be affected. Some have referred to this as the distinction between chance and choice. In other words, avoiding the chance of a genetic disease by choosing to edit and therefore avoid such genetic diseases in the future. We can all agree that this is certainly a lofty and worthy goal, because in the long run, this could, in principle, rid humanity of what some have referred to as the monogenic scourge. That is to say, the multitude of monogenic diseases that have been recorded and at present have no preventive therapy available. The second question we may wish to ask ourselves, what universe of maladies do we actually have in mind? Surely we are not considering addressing the more than 10,000 human monogenic disorders known to men, which are listed in the database known as the Online Mendelian Inheritance in Men, which has been maintained and is being maintained by Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. More likely, we are going to be editing what I would refer to as edit-suitable maladies, maladies for which at present peri- and postnatal medical therapy is infeasible, maladies for which peri- and postnatal somatic editing, that is to say after birth, is ineffective, maladies for which PGD is inutile for one reason or another, and in fact, maladies wherein PGD gives rise to rate-limited embryo complement, which is a common problem, as you know, with PGD. You have to go through several cycles, and more often than not, you end up with less embryos than you would like. Ultimately, we are likely to target alleles that are highly penetrant, singular, because that would complicate it if there are multiple. And of course, such alleles would have to be CRISPR accessible. Finally, before we get into the nitty-gritty of it all, we may want to ask ourselves, what is the state of the art today? And one would have to say that it is quite nascent, which is to say, on the one hand, it's so near, on the other hand, it's so far. We are certainly not ready today to embark safely on germline genome editing. The story from the point of view of embryo editing really dates back to April 18, 2015, where an article saw press on the pages of Protein Cell. This was a paper first authored by Professor Ho Wang from Sun Yat-sen University, who edited tripronuclear zygotes, that is to say, non-viable zygotes that would never be transferred, and therefore could be edited or experimented with, which is what he did. Professor Wang focused on the wild-type beta globin gene as the editing target. He achieved low editing efficiency, minimal editing specificity, and limited editing uniformity, so hardly a smashing success. However, by dint of being the first, this paper was included in Nature's 10, the 10 people who mattered this year, back in 2015. And so this paper, despite its relative or modest accomplishments, nevertheless is the first paper ever wherein embryo editing was attempted. And that brings the story back to 2015, and everything else evolves from there. In 2017, the National Academy of Medicine of the United States issued a report on human genome editing. And although it didn't make substantial references to the clinical utility of human genome editing, it did make the statement that you see in front of you, the main emphasis of which was, again, proceed with care. And that was the main message we were left with. It was not until August of 2017 that a truly meaningful paper on editing of human embryos saw press in Nature, courtesy of Professor Mitalipov from the Oregon Health and Sciences University. Professor Mitalipov focused on the sarcomere gene, which, when mutated, gives rise to an autosomal dominant malady known as familial hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. As you probably know, this disease is incurable. It is amenable to symptomatic care, but subjects who are affected by this disease often succumb to sudden cardiac death. In his experiments, Professor Mitalipov reported when editing 18 hours post-fertilization, editing a zygote 18 hours post-fertilization, he reported 67% efficiency and a mosaicism rate of 24%, which I mentioned earlier was, of course, unacceptable. When he changed his paradigm to editing zygotes at the time of fertilization, the editing efficiency he obtained was now 72%, and the mosaicism rate substantially decreased to 2.4%, probably because when you do it early, the division of the zygote then perpetuates the editing changes, hopefully to every subsequent cell in the embryo. In both cases, though, he noted on-target indels, which is to say, a variety of mutations in and around the gene in question, which, as we said earlier, in itself would also be undesirable, if not unacceptable. Dr. Mitalipov concluded that zygotic editing at fertilization enhances editing efficiency and uniformity, if not specificity, but that further optimization will clearly be required if clinical application is to be entertained. Very shortly after publication, various critiques appeared on the pages of Nature. Here is one such critique, which questioned the very existence of interhomolog repair in fertilized human eggs. Another one which suggested that Professor Mitalipov overlooked large deletions including of whole chromosomes possibly, which were missed by his group. Various questions that were ultimately responded to by Ma et al. At a later point in time. Suffice it to say that this paper proved to be controversial and that significant correspondence on that issue transpired on the pages of Nature after the original publication. Some of the critiques that were raised were, does the interhomolog repair presumption actually hold up? Have CRISPR-mediated rearrangements, deletions, and loss of heterozygosity been missed altogether? And has the hoped-for wild-type homozygosity been unequivocally documented? The critique argued that none of this could be confirmed or sufficiently affirmed, and therefore left this otherwise important paper in some form of limbo. In September of 2020, the National Academy of Medicine of the United States and the Royal Society of the United Kingdom combined to put together a commission that was to focus strictly on heritable genome editing or germline editing. This commission was co-chaired by Kay Davis from the UK and Richard Lifton from the United States. Dr. Lifton is the president of Rockefeller University in New York. In September of last year, the commission issued its report, which was far more clinical than the report I mentioned earlier of the National Academy of Medicine. And several clinical recommendations were made. First, no attempt should be made to establish pregnancies following editing of a human embryo that has undergone human editing. Clinical use of heritable human genome editing should proceed incrementally. Clinical use of heritable human genome editing should be limited to serious monogenic diseases. And clinical use of heritable human genome editing must guarantee impeccable editing efficiency, specificity, and uniformity, as well as euploidy and appropriate embryonic development. A very conservative report, but in my opinion, appropriately conservative, considered the science that existed last September. And that committee, which had significant expertise in science, in ethics, and in genetics in particular, that includes the chair of the commission, issued, I think, what was an appropriate report for the time. If only to strengthen this argument, we may want to take note of a paper that saw press after the commission issued its report in December of 2020. That paper, which saw press in the journal Cell, was authored by a group of investigators led by Dieter Egli from Columbia University in New York. In this paper, Professor Egli reported unrepaired double-strand breaks and a variety of other consequences that followed attempts to edit a human embryo. He also noted off-target effects of Cas9 that cause not only indels, but actual chromosome loss. In other words, the possibility that in the process of editing the human embryo, we would actually end up losing whole chromosomes, which was speculated upon following the Mitalipov paper in 2017, has now been confirmed. In other words, under the present circumstances and with the editors we have at hand, it would appear that when we attempt using current technology to edit the human embryo, we can end up with significant genetic mayhem, including actual loss of chromosomes. Dr. Egli tried to put a positive face on this by pointing out that there may be some utility in some contexts to perhaps eliminate a chromosome, for example, one that is responsible for aneuploidy. But that aside, the point is made that at this time, the technology is simply not controlled enough, not precise enough to allow us to deal with what ultimately is human destiny. We are, after all, seeking to repair a genetic defect. The last thing we want is to introduce a new genetic defect that wasn't there in the first place, with all the good intentions that we may have with respect to correcting a genetic defect. In addition to the paper by Dr. Egli, not long after that, two other papers that were quite critical of the utility of heritable genome editing at this time were posted on the preprint server for biology. One of them, the paper by Kathy Nayakan from the United Kingdom, has since been published, I believe, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. That paper, like the paper of Egli, reported loss of heterozygosity in CRISPR-edited early human embryos. The other paper that was posted on the preprint server from Shukrat Mitalipov has yet to see press. In other words, it has yet to be reviewed and published by a journal. It's presently still on the preprint server. In it, even Dr. Mitalipov, I think, has come around to realize that our ability at this point to effectuate precise changes in the embryonic genome are still somewhat limited. So in summary, I would say that embryo-based, clinically reliable heritable human genome editing is probably unlikely in the foreseeable future. It is possible, and we can have a more detailed discussion on that later, that gamete-based heritable human genome editing using cultured stem cell-derived eggs and sperm, which has yet to be accomplished in the human, may well prove to be the preferred route forward because it could be done in a dish in vitro. You could have multiple dishes and you could exercise quality control, the likes of which you cannot exercise when you edit a few human embryos or zygotes that are far more limited in terms of their numbers and in terms of one's ability to select, if you will, the perfect embryo for ultimate transfer. So clearly, we have significant challenges here. But in addition to the scientific or clinical challenges that we are dealing with, every country, probably in keeping with its nature and laws, is going to also have to deal with statutory challenges, regulatory challenges, because this technology would have to be approved by regulatory agencies, ethical challenges, religious challenges, and general societal challenges, in that not everybody is comfortable with the notion of heritable human genome editing. On the statutory side, in the United States, and I can only speak to the United States, we now have a law. It's known as a recurrent annual rider that states that the FDA, the agency that regulates or would regulate human heritable genome editing, the law says that the FDA is not to adjudicate, quote, research in which a human embryo is intentionally modified to include heritable genetic modification. In a word, this law prohibits the conduct of embryo editing in the United States at this time, at least in the clinical research context. You can do laboratory research, but you cannot do clinical research. And by the way, if you want to do laboratory research like Dr. Mitalipov or Dr. Egli, you will not be funded by the government. There is a separate law that prohibits the funding of human embryo research in the United States. And so that gives you some idea, although it's United States specific, a country wherein we still have significant debates about abortion, the meaning of life, and the ability to manipulate an embryo. At least in the United States, as you can see, there are significant restrictions on both research in human embryo editing and the clinical application thereof. As I said, this will all but prevent the FDA, the agency that regulates or would regulate human embryo editing, from establishing whether or not this is safe and efficacious. That, at this point, is out of the question. There are also ethical issues that are not specific to the United States and are clearly universal. There are elements, particularly in the disability community, that object to heritable human genome editing on the grounds that it would deprive the disability community of what is known as disability pride. This may strike some of you as somewhat unusual, but the reality is that in some disability communities, there is actually a certain pride in subsistence with a disability, and in fact, even the desire to transfer the same to their progeny. There are also ethical concerns because of the prospect of state-led eugenics. The specter of eugenics that is not all that far in the past always comes up as a concern, with the idea that the state may actually step in and requires certain gene modifications that have a eugenic overhang and therefore may be ethically completely unacceptable. There is, of course, the issue of the heritability of edits and the fact that we are intervening and changing the course of evolution. That's a brand new concept that we never entertained because it was infeasible. But now humanity has the power, in principle, to modify the course of evolution, because any of the edits that we will introduce will be propagated down the line. Now, some of you, particularly those of you who are physicians and who swore to the Hippocratic Oath, would argue that eliminating disease can only be viewed as a positive development, and the fact that we eliminate it from the genetic pool can only be a positive undertaking. Still, that is not a point without dissent or debate, and in different countries, probably different perspectives exist on all of these points that are of an ethical nature. There's even the point raised that when you edit a human embryo, you obviously have never had the opportunity to involve the future progeny. And in theory, you may have violated the rights of such, and you certainly could not secure consent. Again, some of you may view this as somewhat unreasonable in expectation. After all, we do many things in IVF and during pregnancy with the well-being of the future progeny in mind. And so to some, this is, again, not exactly a reasonable proposition, but it is part of the ethical debate. There are religious concerns that differ, of course, between religions and between countries, but in most cases have something to do with the sanctity of human life and the notion that editing violates the sanctity of human life. The notion that human editing might violate the dignity of procreation, that is to say, the natural process of procreation, which, for example, is still a bone of contention for the Catholic Church, for example, which does not approve of IVF because it is not a natural form of procreation. There are those who would argue that editing a human embryo is a form of hubris, and that we are interfering with the otherwise vision of a God who oversees so much of what transpires in human life, including recreation. And so to some, human genome editing is a form of hubris that is unacceptable. And as I said, that could mean to some that one is usurping divine power, whichever God or deity one happens to be believing in. And so there's a series of religious observations that differ from country to country, from religion to religion, but which doubtlessly will have to be dealt with along the way as well. And there is, of course, a general societal disquietude, which is not unique to heritable human genome editing. It's a disquietude that applies to every new development in science. That has been true forever, and is all the more true when it comes to human scientific developments, and even more so reproductive scientific developments. I don't have to remind you that only 40 years ago, IVF was considered anathema to a great many people, in the United Kingdom included, in the United States for certain, and possibly in many other nations. The establishment of the first IVF clinic in the United States required overcoming significant opposition by the local Catholic community at Norfolk, Virginia. And so societal disquietude, whether intrinsic, religious, or otherwise, is also something we need to appreciate. Whenever there are new developments, it takes a while for society to get used to it. It may take a generation, meaning your children or your grandchildren, who may view this as a natural phenomenon and not one that they need to be preoccupied with. Time will tell whether that's the case. I think human experience is that as time goes by, what seems so revolutionary, so disruptive, so disturbing, when it transpires, eventually quiets down. But there is this societal fear of the imponderable. We can't imagine what this means. It's the fear of the unknown and unfamiliar. It's the fear of revising the laws of nature. It's the fear of tampering with creation. It's the fear of altering the natural order of things, and a fear that is in many ways resistant to cerebral argument because it's not a cerebral concern. It is a spontaneous, natural, unresistible concern. And that's been true of humanity forever. And examples abound. And so, as we speak today, we must realize that we are in the midst of a process that began only in 2012. It hasn't been a decade since CRISPR made it onto the scene, which is not a very long time for humanity to develop the necessary tools, adjust to all that there is to be, one needs to adjust to, and I mentioned quite a few elements of that. And so it is, as everything else, a function of time. Technology will improve, human acceptance will be improved, religious objections will be smoothed out or resign themselves to the new status quo as they have ultimately to IVF. And so I close this presentation by saying to be continued, in that if we were to meet again, let's say a decade from now, I suspect that much of what I've said today will become inapplicable, and that the general mood will have been very different at that time. But for the time being, I think the appropriate admonition is to proceed with caution. So with that, I'm going to end. I realize that we are already 45 minutes into the hour, and seems like an appropriate time to stop. And if there are any questions, of course, I will be pleased to entertain those. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adashi, for this excellent talk. We have a couple of questions from me and from the audience as well. Our understanding, according to your talk, it appears that CRISPR-Cas9 technology is currently removed from entering the clinical routine applications for several reasons. Besides the ethical problems, mosaicism and off-target effects, and even more seriously, the whole chromosome loss are the major concerns that prevents the use of this strategy into routine clinical daily basis use. So my question at this point, and we know there is a recent discovery of anti-CRISPR proteins, even though not tested in human. And we know that the addition of these anti-CRISPR proteins decrease the number of target effects or of targets in this. So what are you thinking about it? How are you feeling about this? Do you
Yes.
think that this can be promising in the future?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Optam. I think what you are pointing out is very useful, and I'd like to say a few things about what essentially is or are ongoing efforts to improve the technology,
Mm-hmm.
because that is where we are stumbling right now, right? Only in the last 2 weeks, for example, two major developments transpired, which are perhaps too early to include in a presentation, but are indicative of the speed with which everything's happening. So, for example, a paper so pressed in the last 2 weeks in a very respectable journal that reported a base editor that is virtually free of any disruption of the genome. Base editors in general, because they do not create a double-strand break, have been safer than CRISPR proper.
Mm-hmm.
But even they have not been sufficiently safe and efficacious to be clinically applied. But continuous improvements are being made, and human ingenuity being what it is, and the huge number of laboratories worldwide that are applying themselves to this issue are yielding results all the time. The other thing that I will mention, a whole new system, if you will, or paradigm to edit was reported in the last few weeks by a technology referred to as retrons, R-E-T-R-O-N-S, by a group that published its results in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a group that included, among others, Professor George Church from Harvard University, who back in 2013 was one of two groups that applied bacterial CRISPR for use in the human context. He's a significant scientist, a highly creative scientist, and it's possible that this new technology might in fact take over CRISPR, if you will, if it indeed proves to be safe and effective. What I'm trying to say is that the lecture I gave today cannot be viewed in static terms. What I said was applicable for today. It is entirely possible that in a relatively short span of time, there will be completely new developments that will render CRISPR or an alternative technology safe and effective in heritable genome editing. Maybe my projection that I will be meeting with you again in a decade is pessimistic. Maybe this will happen much faster. So I didn't mean to imply that we are in a steady state or that we are somehow frozen in time or that science stopped from progressing. No, I mean, if you follow the literature, as I'm sure you do, you will discover, as I do, that every week when you open the last issue of Nature, Science, Cell, Proceedings of the National Academy, etc., new developments transpire, not all of them successful, promising, or definitive. But one day, just like the day when Louise Brown was born, one day the technology will reach a point where it is acceptable. And then we will have perhaps the more difficult issue of convincing ourselves, our government, our religious leaders, and others that this is one safe and effective, but two, that it is also desirable and justifiable.
Thank you. And the second question is, perhaps the use of stem cell-derived gametes will be a good platform or the cell type to study, to at least to get more information about the safety of CRISPR. But as a clinician scientist working in this molecular biology, let's say, we know that when you induce the stem cells, induce pluripotency, or when you obtain gametes from the stem cells, they spend more times under in vitro conditions. So they are not ready, or they have not completed their reprogramming for becoming a fetus or for full competence for development. I'm not talking not only in the also we shouldn't forget the effects of epigenetic changes when you keep them under in vitro conditions. So how are we going to differentiate the effects of the off-target effects of the CRISPR from those occurring after exposed to in vitro conditions? I think this is a very important question. What do you think about that?
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I'll say a few things. First of all, I think it's interesting that the commission I described earlier, the one that was comprised of the United States National Academy of Medicine and the United Kingdom Royal Society, made a special mention of stem cell-derived gametes as an option, which was interesting because of two reasons. As we speak today, there are, of course, no human stem cell-derived gametes yet. The process has been completely and successfully seemingly recapitulated in the rodent, in the female rodent, I should say, by Katsuhiko Hayashi from Japan. But the closest we have gotten to an oocyte in the human, a stem cell-derived oocyte, was in a paper in Science in 2019 by a group from Kyoto, but that hasn't gone beyond the point of the oogonia. In other words, we have not been able to recapitulate gametogenesis in the human egg or in the human sperm in vitro at this point. By that I mean stem cell derived. So first of all, the technology is not there yet, and we're going to have to wait until the human situation catches up. But in terms of your question about epigenetic changes, about safety, all of which are valid, all I can say is, and that hasn't been looked at carefully enough, but in a Nature paper by Hatsuhiko Hayashi from 2016, which described the sequence in the female rodent, the oocytes that were derived seemed normal for, at least from a superficial point of view. They were also fertilizable, if you recall, and the embryos that resulted were transferred and gave rise to pups in the mice in question. So clearly, significant work will have to be done to validate the safety and efficacy of stem cell-derived gametes. First, we'll have to make it happen in the human. We haven't yet. And when we do, we're going to have to be sure that these reagents, as you say, are safe and effective. In the United States, again, this will require approval by the FDA. You could not use these reagents clinically in the United States without approval by the FDA. At this time, there is no law against that. In other words, we are allowed to both fund the research and apply to the FDA for approval with gametes, as long as it's not embryos. So we'll have to wait and see, but every indication is that this may well be a safer way to go, because you will have multiple dishes to work with and therefore engage in quality control that's not feasible with 8 to 10 embryos that you have in the course of an IVF cycle. When and if this will happen, of course, nobody knows. But we said something earlier about the future and about the fact that IVF as we know it will likely change. Stem cell-derived gametes will obviously disrupt IVF as we know it. And among other things, they just might make heritable human genome editing feasible. And we'll just have to patiently wait, first for it to happen, and secondly, for the careful evaluation of these new reagents to convince ourselves that they're actually safe and effective and therefore appropriate for clinical use.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Adashi. We really appreciate it. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. We hopefully looking forward to see you in our next meetings with different topics, like we talked before the starting the session, the IVFs, the changing in IVF, where it's changing, where it's heading to. That could be a new excellent topic for a future talk. Once again, thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
See you hopefully live in real meetings in Istanbul. Thank you.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Değerli konuklar, katılmanız için hepinize çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Doktor Adashi'nin de özetlediği gibi CRISPR-Cas9 teknolojisi de dahil olmak üzere gen editleme henüz klinik kullanım aşamasına girmedi ve yakın gelecekte de girebilecek gibi görünmüyor. Bunun en büyük kısıtlamalarından etik sorunların dışında teknik problemler, mosaisizm, off-target etkiler, kromozom kaybı ve bunların getirdiği etkilere bağlı olarak şu an yakın gelecekte böyle bir şey görünmüyor. IVF pratiğimizde hepimizin bildiği gibi aneuploidiler, IVF'in 3 temel endikasyonu olduğunu düşünürsek, fertilitenin korunması, infertilite ve genetik hastalıkların PGD yapılarak sağlıklı embriyoların yerleştirilmesiydi. Gen editleme buna ne getirecek? Bu konuda nasıl değişecek? Bu konu daha uzun süre tartışılacağı benziyor. Ama Doktor Adashi'nin de vurguladığı gibi baş döndürücü değişmeler var. Bilim çok hızlı bir şekilde ilerliyor. Dolayısıyla bu konu ne yöne evrilecek? 5 sene sonra bunları ne şekilde tartışıyor olacağız? Bunları ancak zaman gösterecek. Hepinize katılımlarınız için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Kendim ve yönetim kurulu adına.